was always on a Sunday. Always after church. Always in the same room with the same lace curtains freshly pressed. From 1873 to 1896, the small town of Elk Hollow, Nebraska, buried 8 women who all had one thing in common. They were married to the same man, Eusebius Crane. To outsiders, Eusebius was a quiet widower, a God-fearing man whose sorrow seemed to follow him like a fog. Each of his wives had died under different circumstances: a fall from the stairs, a tragic illness, a house fire. The townspeople whispered, but never loudly, because Eusebius was polite, generous, and strangely persuasive. It wasn't until the 9th woman, who was never legally married to him, tried to flee, that the pattern unraveled. And what was found under the floorboards of his house still makes the soil of Elk Hollow unfit for planting. This is not just the story of a serial killer. It's the chronicle of a man who believed he had a covenant with God, one that no woman was allowed to break. Stay with us until the end, because the last letter Eusebius wrote before his execution rewrote everything the town believed about guilt, death, and salvation. Subscribe for more twisted true stories that history tried to bury. Chapter 1: The Widower of Elk Hollow. The first time someone saw Eusebius Crane cry, it was at the funeral of Mary Ellen McGrath. She had been his wife for less than a year. A kind girl from St. Louis, Mary Ellen arrived in Elk Hollow in 1873 with pale skin, too thin wrists, and a hopeful smile. She was quiet, obedient, and deeply religious. The local women took to her quickly. She helped with sewing, donated to the church, and never raised her voice, not even when she was seen limping home after market one October afternoon. Her death was ruled an accident. According to Eusebius, she slipped while fetching water from the well and broke her neck on the stone edge. The doctor, a whiskey-breathed man with trembling hands, signed the certificate without much inspection. After all these things happened, the prairie was unforgiving, and grief, for men like Eusebius, was sacred. But it wasn't her fall that disturbed the neighbors, it was the sermon Eusebius gave at her funeral. Standing in front of the congregation, eyes swollen with tears, he spoke not of loss but of cleansing. "The Lord giveth," he said, "but he also takes. And when he takes, it is not always a punishment. Sometimes, it is protection. Sometimes, it is mercy." Some wept with him. Others felt a coldness creep into their spine. Mercy? What did she need mercy from? 3 months later, Eusebius brought home wife number 2, Lillian May. She was 22, fair-haired, with an accent that suggested a distant upbringing. He told the townsfolk they'd met through letters, a sort of Christian courtship. Lillian didn't smile as much as Mary Ellen had. She walked a little slower, spoke a little softer, and often stared out the window like she was watching something no one else could see. 6 weeks into the marriage, the parlor caught fire. The neighbors helped extinguish the flames, but it was too late. Lillian's body was found upstairs, her hands blistered, her mouth open in a silent scream. Eusebius was discovered unconscious near the front door, soot-stained but alive. The sheriff questioned him only once. "She tried to light the stove," Eusebius said. "The flame caught the curtains. I tried to reach her. God knows I did." No one doubted him. Elk Hollow was a town that clung to the idea of divine order. And to question Eusebius Crane, a man who dressed in black on Sundays and read aloud from Revelation, felt like tempting fate. By the time his third wife, Abigail, arrived in 1876, there were already rumors. But they were whispered over pie crusts and washing lines, not loud enough to be heard, not strong enough to confront. Abigail was different. She was sharp-tongued, raised in Chicago, and had once taught in a girls' seminary. She walked arm in arm with Eusebius in public but never lingered close when he wasn't looking. One night, during a storm, she was found drowned in the creek behind the church. No one saw her fall. No one heard her scream. And yet, her body was bloated with river water, tangled in reeds as if she'd been held down. This time the whispering grew louder. But Eusebius had already purchased her grave plot, arranged her headstone, and wrote a hymn in her memory, a hymn that the choir still sings every winter. 3 wives. 3 deaths. But grief has a way of numbing doubt, and the people of Elk Hollow wanted peace more than truth. They let him grieve. They let him marry again. By 1881 he had buried 4 wives. And the town had learned to avoid asking questions. But behind the doors of the Crane estate, something was changing. Visitors noted how the lace curtains never moved, how no laughter came from within. Eusebius stopped attending town gatherings. He still went to church, always dressed in black, but he sat in the back pew and muttered prayers no one could hear. When he returned with wife number 5, Roseanne, She was introduced not in the chapel but at her funeral just 2 months later. The official story: a fever that consumed her in 3 days. The doctor this time refused to sign. But he was found dead of natural causes, just days after expressing his doubts. Some say Eusebius had friends. Others believe it was simply the town's will to forget. But no one forgot the graveyard. The far left corner, under the willow tree, held the markers of 6 of his wives by 1890. Each stone bore the same inscription: beloved and returned to God in grace. It wasn't until the 8th wife, Miriam, that things began to unravel. Chapter 2, The One Who Fought Back. Miriam Bell was nothing like the others. She was neither young nor frail, neither submissive nor quiet. She arrived in Elk Hollow in 1893 with a suitcase in one hand and a revolver in the other, not brandished but visible enough that people remembered it. Her hair was short for the time, her boots scuffed, and her mouth, as the pastor's wife once said, unfitting for a lady. Eusebius met her in Omaha, allegedly during a church revival. He told the congregation she had survived a mining disaster, lost her family to cholera, and found solace in the Word of God. No one dared question her past, mostly because she never spoke of it. But the town noticed something strange. Miriam didn't seem afraid of him. She walked beside Eusebius like an equal, not behind. She questioned his sermons, interrupted him during meals, and once during a church gathering she laughed, loud and sudden, when he misquoted a verse from Corinthians. It made the townspeople uncomfortable. Not because she was rude but because she lived. For the first time in years Eusebius seemed unsure. His steps were slower, his glances sharper, as if constantly watching her for cracks, weaknesses, submission. But Miriam gave none. And perhaps that was why she lived longer than the others. 6 months to be exact. By then rumors had reached even the outer farms, that Eusebius had been seen digging late at night near the willow tree, that strange lights glowed from the attic of his home, that someone, a child maybe, had screamed behind closed doors and never been seen again. But it was Miriam's letter that turned whispers into fire. One morning in early December, Pastor Whitmore received a folded paper tucked under his door. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was elegant and sharp. The note read, "If I disappear, it was not the will of God. It was the will of a man who believes himself to be him." Pastor Whitmore froze. His wife begged him to burn the letter, and he almost did. But something in Miriam's words clawed at him, kept him awake at night. On the 4th night he walked to the sheriff's office with trembling hands. Sheriff Roland Buckner was a man of few words and fewer convictions. He'd been re-elected 3 times not for solving crimes, but for keeping the peace. Confronting Eusebius Crane, the most respected or feared man in town, was not a peacekeeping move. So the letter was locked in a drawer. Forgotten. Or so Buckner thought. What he didn't know was that Miriam had written 8 more copies, each one hidden in a different place: the church organ, the choir robes, even inside the Bible that sat on Eusebius' pulpit. By the time Miriam disappeared, the letters began surfacing. Each one painted a fuller picture. She claimed to have found locks of hair under the floorboards. She described waking up to her husband whispering numbers in a foreign language. She wrote about a small room in the cellar that smelled of iron and wet earth. And worst of all, she believed she was being poisoned. But Miriam never made it to the train station. On the day she was supposed to leave, her suitcase packed, her revolver missing, she was nowhere to be found. Eusebius claimed she had run away in the night, overtaken by a spirit of madness. This time the town didn't believe him. Sheriff Buckner returned with deputies the next morning. They found the house locked, the parlor dark, the air thick. Eusebius welcomed them with a Bible in hand and said nothing. What they found in the cellar shattered Elk Hollow's silence forever. There were no bodies, not yet, but there were symbols etched into the stone walls. Ancient, circular, not Christian. There was a rusted chain bolted to the floor. And in the corner, half buried under dirt, a wedding dress that wasn't Miriam's. The cellar extended deeper than it should have. Behind a rotted plank, they uncovered a tunnel no more than 5 feet high, leading beneath the house toward the graveyard. Inside the tunnel, bones. Small ones. Human. And not all adult. The sheriff vomited in the yard. One deputy ran to ring the church bell, not in mourning but in alarm. For the first time in decades, the people of Elk Hollow gathered in the square for something other than a sermon. Eusebius was arrested at sunset. He didn't resist. He didn't weep. He simply turned to Pastor Whitmore and said, "I warned her. The covenant was sacred. Miriam's body was never found. But her revolver was. Wrapped in linen. Buried behind the willow tree. and next to it 8 wedding rings, each one engraved with a name. The names of every wife Eusebius Crane had ever buried. The rings were each laid in a perfect circle, not thrown, not buried at random. The soil around them had been packed with care, and the linen wrappings were still dry, as if they'd been placed there only days before. The sheriff stared at them in silence. He didn't speak when the townspeople began to arrive, didn't move when the church bell tolled again. It was Pastor Whitmore who finally stepped forward, removed his hat, and knelt before the makeshift grave. He recognized the names. Each one etched carefully inside the gold bands. Mary Ellen, Lillian, Abigail, Roseanne, Charlotte, Ruth, Esther, Miriam. But what chilled him most was the 8th name. Because Miriam Bell was still missing. He looked up at the sheriff, voice shaking. She buried herself? Sheriff Buckner's reply was a whisper. Or he buried her before we even started looking. They searched the grounds for hours. The parlor, the kitchen, the cellar, every drawer and beam. Behind a bookshelf they discovered a false wall. And behind the wall, a staircase. It led to a room no one had seen before. No windows. No light. Inside, a single wooden chair. An open Bible on a table, pages marked in red. 8 portraits hung on the wall. Each one was of a different woman, drawn by hand with haunting precision. The portraits were signed. To my eternal bride. You see. 7 of the portraits had a red X, slashed across them. The 8th, Miriam, was untouched. They didn't wait for a trial. The town was done whispering. By morning, a judge had been summoned from the next county. Eusebius was charged with 8 counts of murder and 1 of attempted escape from justice. But no one truly expected him to confess. Not Eusebius. Not the man who preached about blood like it was scripture. But he did. In court, before a room thick with gasps and trembling hands, he stood and said, "They broke the covenant. They were mine. The Lord gave them to me and I returned them when they were no longer pure. That is the balance of things." He spoke calmly without shame. Like a man describing the weather. When asked if he regretted anything, he paused, smiled, and answered, "Only that I did not cleanse the town as I had planned. There is rot in Elk Hollow. I only trimmed the vines." They sentenced him to death that afternoon. He requested no last meal, only that his Bible be buried with him. But as they led him from the courthouse, he stopped on the steps, turned to the crowd and said one final thing. "There is still one more. She lives. But not for long." The crowd froze. Murmurs turned to panic. The judge ordered silence, but it was too late. The damage was done. 3 days later, a schoolteacher named Clara Reynolds, who had once rejected a marriage proposal from Eusebius, was found hanging from the rafters of her home. No note. No sign of forced entry. Just a single rose laid on her pillow. And beneath it, a page torn from Eusebius' Bible. The verse was underlined in blood. "For the Lord hath chosen whom to strike and whom to spare." A storm rolled over Elk Hollow the night of the execution. Thunder cracked above the gallows as the crowd gathered, most in silence, some in prayer. Eusebius Crane didn't flinch when the noose was placed around his neck. Didn't tremble when asked for final words. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "I kept my word. I always do." The trapdoor opened. The town at last exhaled. But beneath the gallows, hours later, a gravedigger found something that would haunt Elk Hollow for generations. A 9th ring. Unmarked. Freshly polished. Still warm to the touch. Chapter 3, The Covenant and the Crimson Ledger. After the execution, Elk Hollow tried to return to normal. The church bells resumed their Sunday rhythm. The market reopened. Children were told to stay indoors after dusk, not because of Eusebius, but because of what might have remained in his absence. The townspeople burned his belongings. The lace curtains were torn and fed to the fire. The portraits, those chilling sketches of the 8 women, were locked in the sheriff's office, never to be spoken of again. But there was one item they missed. A book. Leather-bound. Black. No title. It was discovered by a drifter who broke into the abandoned Crane house 3 weeks after the execution. The man, a railroad worker passing through, claimed to have found it beneath the mattress of the cellar room. He brought it to the church, terrified. Inside were names. Hundreds of them. Each name was followed by a date. Some were crossed out in red. Others circled. At the bottom of each page, a symbol, always the same. A circle split by a vertical line intersected by a downward arrow. Pastor Whitmore called it the Crimson Ledger. At first, the names seemed unrelated. But when the pastor read aloud the ones marked in red, something clicked. Rebecca Lynn, drowned in 1882. Dorothy Hall, found frozen in her barn 1886. Clara Reynolds, hanged 1896. They were all local women. Some had died mysteriously. Others had simply disappeared. None were wives of Eusebius Crane. The Crimson Ledger wasn't a record of his marriages. It was a list of those who refused him. It included girls as young as 14, widows, midwives, school teachers. And every time one rejected his courtship, they appeared in the ledger. Some with dates of death. Some with no date at all. Those were the names that kept Pastor Whitmore awake. He shared the book only with Sheriff Buckner, and together they made a list. Of the 37 circled names, only 3 women were still alive. All 3 were contacted discreetly. 2 had moved out of state. One, Eloise Granger, still lived in Elk Hollow, tending to her blind father on the edge of town. She refused to speak at first. But after seeing the ledger, her hands shook. "He came to me once," she said, "before he married Mary Ellen. Said he saw righteous fire in me. Asked me to cleanse with him. I thought he was mad." She never told anyone, not even her father. But 1 month later their house had caught fire. She and her father survived, barely, and the cause was never determined. Now, decades later, Eloise realized the fire had been no accident. He saw refusal as rot. Women as vessels. If you cracked the vessel, you had to pour it out. That line stayed with Pastor Whitmore. He repeated it to himself that night, staring at the ledger by candlelight. The next morning the book was gone. Vanished from his locked drawer. No sign of entry, no prints, no damage. Just gone. And in its place, on the windowsill of the chapel, a 9th portrait, drawn in the same hand as the others. Same charcoal lines. Same delicate strokes. But it wasn't Miriam. And it wasn't Eloise. It was the pastor's daughter, Lydia Whitmore, 15 years old, unmarried, innocent, and until that moment, completely untouched by the horror of Eusebius Crane. She was missing by noon. A search party was formed immediately. They combed the town, the woods, the creek, even the old Crane property, though most refused to enter the cellar. But Lydia was nowhere. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No note. Just her shawl, folded neatly at the church altar. And one verse carved into the pew. "The covenant is never broken. It waits." That night, Pastor Whitmore collapsed. He had a stroke, they said. Never spoke again. He died 3 days later. But before his death, he scrawled a final message into his Bible's cover page, with hands that could barely move. I don't think he acted alone. The idea that Eusebius Crane had help was not only disturbing, it was devastating. People wanted closure. They needed a monster, a single face to blame. But what if he was just the mouthpiece of something older, deeper? One of the deputies began researching the symbols in the cellar. He sent sketches to a university in Boston, which returned a single word in reply: Pythian. A reference to the ancient oracle cults, where men believed they could channel divine judgment, using women as vessels of prophecy or sacrifice. The circle with the line and arrow wasn't just a symbol. It was a sigil of renewal, of purification by fire, blood, and silence. And Elk Hollow, a quiet, faithful town, had been the perfect place for such a covenant to grow. People there were taught to forgive, to respect their elders, to mind their own business. And so they did, until the rot outgrew the roots. But even rot, once exposed, can spread. Because months after Lydia's disappearance, something new began to happen. Every year, on the anniversary of Eusebius' death, a single rose was found on the altar of the church. Always fresh. Always red. Always with a single phrase written in the same handwriting. The covenant endures. No one ever saw who left it. No prints. No witnesses. No notes. Just the rose. And the growing sense that Elk Hollow was never cleansed. It had only been witnessed. Years passed. People moved away. The children of Elk Hollow grew up with stories their parents never fully explained. The church was eventually repainted. The Crane house demolished. But the soil never softened. Nothing grew under the willow tree. Not grass, not moss, not even weeds. And every now and then, someone would see a shadow in the church bell tower, long after services ended. Or hear footsteps in the graveyard when no one else was there. The town adapted. They built a new school. Opened a rail station. Pretended the past had been put to rest. Until 1921. The mayor's daughter disappeared. Her name was Florence. 17, engaged, well-loved. She vanished after choir rehearsal one winter evening. The doors of the church were locked from the inside. The only thing left behind, a sheet of music torn in half. On it, scribbled in pencil, was a name no one had written in decades. You see, it wasn't possible. Eusebius had been dead for 25 years. And yet, in the same week, 3 townspeople reported hearing a man's voice reciting verses in Latin outside their windows at night. A voice they described as measured, soft, and serene. A retired schoolteacher named Ruth Tenley, who had taught Eusebius as a boy, finally stepped forward. She was 89, mostly blind, but her memory remained sharp. He always said he wasn't the first, she told the new sheriff. He said he was chosen. She claimed Eusebius often spoke of a book older than the Bible. A doctrine hidden beneath the soil behind the hymn. He called it the root text, and said one day someone would come looking for it. Ruth didn't know what that meant. But she did remember this. He never smiled when he read the Bible. But he laughed like a child, when he opened his own journal. The sheriff ordered the old church dug up. And beneath the altar, hidden in a compartment of stone, they found a small wooden box. Inside, a ring smaller than the others, a child's ring. A lock of red hair. And a final note, written in that unmistakable hand. The vessel is near. The crimson returns. No signature. But no one needed one. The investigation was buried. The mayor declared it an act of vandalism. The ring, the box, all sent for analysis, but never returned. And Florence? Never found. Just like Lydia. Just like Miriam. The covenant, it seemed, had never been about Eusebius alone. He had merely been its voice. But voices echo. And in Elk Hollow the echo never fades. Each year more petals appear on the church steps. Each decade another girl disappears. Always on a Sunday. Always after service. Always without sound. And always a fresh grave under the willow. With no name carved on the stone. Chapter 4, The Last Wife. It wasn't until 1952 that the phrase, the last wife, appeared in town records. The mention came from a psychiatric evaluation at a facility 60 miles north of Elk Hollow. A young woman, institutionalized after a failed suicide attempt, claimed to be the last wife of Eusebius Crane. Her name was Marla Gibbons. She was 26, unmarried. No prior psychiatric history. She had been found in the woods near Elk Hollow, barefoot and bleeding, murmuring scripture in reverse. The ranger who found her described her condition as possessed but gentle. When doctors questioned her, she spoke plainly, but with a calmness that unnerved everyone in the room. He married me in a dream, she said. He said I was born in blood, shaped in silence and saved for him. She described a wedding ceremony held beneath the willow, attended by 8 women in veils, none of whom spoke. They simply watched. And behind them stood a tall figure in shadow, whose face was covered in branches. Doctors dismissed her visions as delusion. But one therapist, Dr. Eleanor Byers, became obsessed. She began cross-referencing Marla's account with historical data. Names, dates, weather reports. She even traced Marla's family line, and discovered something that froze her blood. Marla was the great-niece of Abigail Crane, Eusebius' 3rd wife. The one who drowned in the creek. When confronted with this, Marla didn't react with surprise. She simply smiled and said, "It always comes back around." Within days, Marla escaped the hospital. She climbed a 3-story drainpipe, broke a window with her bare hand, and vanished into the night wearing only a hospital gown. The next morning, Elk Hollow awoke to find a red ribbon tied around the gates of the Crane family plot. Inside the graveyard, a single set of footprints, a bouquet of dead flowers, and one new grave marker freshly carved. And you see, wife in blood, buried in light. But no one was buried there. Not officially. The earth was disturbed but empty. And Marla was never seen again. That's when the archive project began. It was led by Dr. Byers and a small group of theologians, linguists, and folklorists. They combed through old records, journals, and church archives from Elk Hollow and surrounding towns. What they found was a pattern. Every 27 years, the same sequence of events repeated. A girl disappeared. A page was torn from a Bible. A rose appeared on a public altar. A whispering voice was reported at night. A symbol, the circle and arrow, was found carved near a church. And finally, a new grave appeared in Elk Hollow, always anonymous, always freshly dug but never containing remains. They began to suspect that the covenant was no longer a belief system, but a ritual, self-sustaining and passed through generations like folklore. Not just kept alive but fed. The rituals, the roses, the disappearances, all followed a script, designed to be carried out even without a leader. Eusebius had been a voice, yes, but the system didn't die with him. It simply adapted. Dr. Byers believed that the last wife wasn't a woman at all. It was a concept. She is always the one who knows the most, she wrote. And because of that, she must never live long enough to tell it. The town did what it always did. Buried the rumors. Closed the archives. Sealed the cellar with concrete. But not before Dr. Byers disappeared. Her notes burned. Her office emptied. All that remained was one final letter sent to her colleague, dated May 3, 1954. They watched through glass now. Not windows, reflections. I saw them behind me in the chapel mirror. 8 faces. No eyes. Just mouths, open but not breathing. I think they're waiting for someone to finish what he started. Or worse, start it again. In 1980, the Crane house was rebuilt. A real estate investor from Kansas purchased the land at auction, unaware of its history. Within a year, his daughter, aged 12, was found walking naked through the graveyard at dawn, chanting verses that had not been read in that town for nearly a century. When asked why, she simply replied, "He said I'm ready now." They moved out the next week. And yet the house remained. Sold, resold, abandoned, restored. Each family who moved in left behind a child more broken than before. Some drew pictures of women in black veils. Others wrote backwards. Some didn't speak at all. But they all left behind the same thing, a crude ring made of wire or string. When local police began investigating, one officer, Officer Daniels, decided to destroy what remained of the basement. He took a pickaxe and descended alone. He never came back up. When they finally found his body, it was curled in the corner of the old cellar, his hands clasped in prayer. His mouth sewn shut. No needle. No thread. Just sealed. And on the wall behind him, written in chalk, "She has returned. And she remembers everything." By 2001, the town officially rezoned the Crane estate as undevelopable. But every year someone, usually a child, finds their way to the edge of the property. They return with stories. Always about a man in black, always about 8 women watching from the trees. And they always say the same thing. "He said I'm the last one." Epilogue, the vow that waits. There is no plaque in Elk Hollow. No museum, no marker, no memorial. If you drive through the town today, you'll find a church that doesn't open on Sundays, a cemetery without names on half the graves, and a school where the children don't speak above a whisper. Ask anyone about Eusebius Crane, and they'll blink slowly, either confused or pretending to be. But the silence is a lie. Because the soil still remembers. In 2022, a documentary crew attempted to film in Elk Hollow. They'd heard fragments of the legend, a preacher, missing wives, graves with no bodies. They contacted local officials, offered permits, insurance, even a donation to the Church Restoration Fund. Their request was denied. Twice. So they came anyway. 3 filmmakers. 1 weekend. A drone, a set of infrared cameras, and a desire to prove that the widower of Elk Hollow was just another ghost story. They were never seen again. The only thing found was a single SD card, mailed anonymously to a news station 3 counties away. It contained 6 minutes of footage, shaky, grainy, flickering, but the final image was unmistakable. A circle, split by a vertical line, intersected by a downward arrow. Etched in frost on a church window. Behind it, 8 shadowed figures unmoving. And in front of them, a knife. Not quite visible. But with a hand pressed to the glass. And a voice, barely audible over the static, whispering. "I kept my word." The footage was never aired. The station burned down 3 days later in what was deemed an electrical fire. The SD card was lost. But stories began circulating online. People from other towns, other countries, all reporting the same dream. A wedding beneath a tree. A veil over their face. A voice saying, "Say yes." Some woke screaming. Others didn't wake at all. One woman in Romania claimed her daughter vanished after drawing 8 rings in charcoal on her bedroom wall. She said the girl told her the night before. He asked if I would be his. I told him no. Then he said he already knew I would. The charcoal couldn't be cleaned. They had to burn the wall. But the rings came back the next morning. In Argentina, a pastor collapsed in the middle of a sermon. When the congregation rushed to help, they found his Bible open to a page that did not exist, filled with names written in red ink. All women. All with the initials EC beneath them. And at the bottom of the page, "The covenant is global now." What began as a legend rooted in a Nebraska graveyard had crossed borders, languages, continents. Because the covenant, as it turns out, was never buried. It was planted. And like all seeds, it grew. Linguists who analyzed the symbols found in the Crane cellar connected them not only to Pythian rites but to pre-Christian fertility cults, Mesopotamian sacrifice patterns, and even 16th-century heretic manuscripts from the Alps. The same figure appeared in all of them. A man in black. A council of women. A vow that could not be broken. In every version it ended with a woman saying no. And the world being punished for her defiance. That's what Eusebius believed. That's why he made them say yes. In his journals, found decades after his death, sealed in the walls of the old church steeple, he wrote one phrase over and over, across dozens of pages. Consent is salvation. Obedience is love. Refusal is death. Each entry signed with a flourish. You see. But some pages were different. They were written in a second hand, looser, more frantic. A woman's hand. One of them read, "If anyone finds this, I didn't say yes. I never did. Don't let them say I did. Please." No name. No date. Just that. And beneath it, drawn in faint red ink, a 9th ring. Broken. Today the town of Elk Hollow is listed on some maps as unincorporated. It has no post office. No school board. No mayor. But the graveyard remains. And the willow still grows. Only now, it splits in two. Down its center, the bark has cracked open like a wound. Locals say the tree bleeds in the spring, not sap but a thin red liquid that stains the soil and never dries. Children say it whispers. Women say it calls. Men say it watches. And each year one more grave appears anonymously. Never reported. Never dug by any living hand. Always with a ring. Always on a Sunday. Always with the same inscription. Till death and after. Do you believe he was alone? Or do you think the covenant was only beginning with him? If you made it this far, maybe you were meant to. Subscribe for more stories that were never meant to be unearthed. Because next Sunday, someone else might say yes. And someone, maybe you, might not wake up.